Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels are some of the most notorious thinkers in human history. You might love them, you might hate them, but however you feel about them, you know who they are, and whatever your opinion is, it is probably a strong one to say the least. So, in this episode, we're going to be exploring 5 interesting quotes from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Hello there, friend. Welcome back to History for Thinkers, a show that brings history to life. I've been working on the big series that's coming up, The Rise, Fall, and Decay of Communism, which is going to be a massive multi-part series, pretty much starting from the very beginning of communism. And I just had to make some of these smaller episodes just to talk about some of the interesting things I come across as I do research and get this thing written out. And man, I gotta tell you, there is some wild stuff. But anyway, I really hope you're excited about the rise, fall, and decay of communism. That I'll hopefully be getting the first episode out soon. I recently had a poll the other day where I kind of asked you guys whether you wanted one big thing or smaller chapters. You guys unanimously voted for smaller chapters, so chapter 1 should be dropping soon. I'm not gonna say when. But soon, it's coming. It's on the way, I promise. But with that out of the way, let's get right into the episode. And we're starting off here with a little bit of a longer quote by Engels. But it gets at this really interesting idea of society basically killing its workers. And he writes, quote, "When one individual inflicts bodily injury upon another, such injury that death results, we call the deed manslaughter. When the assailant knew in advance that the injury would be fatal, we call his deed murder. But when society places hundreds of proletarians in such a position that they inevitably meet a too early and an unnatural death, one which is quite as much a death by violence as that by the sword or bullet, when it deprives thousands of the necessaries of life, places them under conditions in which they cannot live, forces them through the strong arm of the law to remain in such conditions until that death ensues, which is the inevitable consequence, knows that these thousands of victims must perish, and yet permits these conditions to remain. Its deed is murder, just as surely as the deed of the single individual, disguised, malicious murder. Murder against which none can defend himself, which does not seem what it is, because no man sees the murderer, because the death of the victim seems a natural one, since the offense is more one of omission than of commission, but murder it remains." Now, what's really interesting about this quote is that this is the first time in recorded history that someone really articulates this idea of social murder, which is essentially where the system, as it is currently designed in the way it's being operated right now, it is essentially killing you. And that is a particularly scary idea, if only for the reason that, just think about how much we hate the thought of being exploited and run into the ground by the system that controls our lives. One of the most popular genres of fiction, it's all about dystopia. Dystopias, where, like 1984, Fahrenheit 451, there are just countless stories where we just hate the way that they make us feel. The idea that we are living in a system that is fundamentally predatory and is ruining us, and yet we have no power to change it. This is one of, honestly, for all the horrible things that you can say about Marx and Engels, and there are many, you really cannot take away their ability to have these really crazy ideas that really do, if you let them, can really fundamentally change the way you see the world. And what makes it all the more nefarious is that the system is killing you, but it is subtle enough that nobody really gets in trouble. If you do not actually see a person pulling the trigger of a gun or stabbing you with a knife or pushing you off a cliff, it doesn't really feel like murder, does it? But his point remains. If there is a system that you're forced to participate in, coerced into, and it's killing you, then it is murder. It is really no different than running someone over or stabbing or shooting them. And this kind of gets us at the idea of who is responsible, right? And if we're going to at least accept the idea for the time being that the system is killing you, right? Whatever system it is, right? Whatever time in history you live, wherever that may be, if it is this social murder that's going on, who is most responsible? Well, the ones who build and maintain this system, right? Because these are the people who benefit the most and are the most responsible for keeping the thing going. So if there is some kind of system, right, capitalism in the case of the communists, that is murdering you, then those who protect and enforce it, they are the ones that are essentially doing the killing, which is kind of the justification they use for, pretty much excusing any murder or violence against what they call the bourgeoisie. The people that own everything, right? The factory owners, the business owners, even politicians to an extent kind of fall under this umbrella term. Because really, these people build the system. This system is hurting you. And, well, if you don't violently murder them, then, well, the system is just going to continue to run you into the ground. And it's this unseen evil. And, I think there's something about that resonates with people, right? Especially people that have been dispossessed by the system. So if you think about some of the modern examples, right, this doesn't necessarily come down to capitalism or, this or that. But there are a lot of ways that this social murder can kind of play into your life. So, right, think about microplastics. That is essentially something that has happened as a result of being part of this system, right? Just by merit of living in the United States and many other places, you've got microplastics in your blood, right? They're in your body. There's nothing you can really do to get them out. And that's just that. Because we've pretty much made plastic part of our daily lives and we can't get away from it. And now, well, you're going to die sooner. You'll probably have more diseases. You won't be as fertile, right? Lower testosterone. I mean, all the horrible health effects that modernity has brought us, right? It really comes back to, this system that we've been participating in. I think another example, one that particularly resonates with me, is the lack of flow state in modern workplaces and schools. Because when you don't hit flow state, which is, if you're not familiar, I do encourage you to look it up. But if you don't hit flow state, you're just destined for misery. This is a chemical release that happens in your brain that makes you feel engaged. It encourages growth. And all the positive feelings that people get from video games, actually, right? You really have to push yourself. You have to gather resources, compete with other players, really grow as a person. As stupid as that might sound, but this is a very old biological mechanism, right? You think about how hunter-gatherers went out hunting. If they didn't hit flow state, they died. So it's a very important part of our psychology as a species, because without it, it's over. It's over. And today we just don't have any place for it, right? We're basically a society full of pencil pushers. We are sitting in front of a computer, right, doing this and that. More busy work bullshit that everyone hates doing, that no one would do if they didn't want to. It's just wild. We'll talk more about all these topics later in this video. But I think another modern example is being forced to take on massive amounts of debt just to survive, right? You gotta own a car, you gotta own a home or rent, which is even more expensive. Healthcare, college. All these things cause financial stress because, right, if you don't have enough money, you end up like the guy in this picture here. And if you're listening to the podcast audio, it's a picture of a homeless man next to an advertisement for the Keeping Up with the Kardashians. So, yeah, without money, you die in the streets, and that's the society we live in. So, whenever you have these necessities of life that cost so damn much money, right? Like healthcare, for example, or housing. you are essentially taking away people's ability to live, right? The more expensive the housing market becomes, the more people are going to be homeless. I mean, it is like a 1-to-1 ratio. I mean, you think about it in supply and demand. If you don't have the financial competitive edge, more money, or enough money to afford a house, you're just going to die in the streets. So, these are all ways in which the system really is in fact killing you, right? Even if it's not direct, even if there's no one that's standing there with a gun shooting you, right? The microplastics, the misery of most people's existence, right? I mean, and then being forced to rely on debt just to live. I think another thing that we do particularly bad in the Western world is we throw away so much of our food supply while people starve in the streets. And again, the system doesn't want them to eat. If it's not profitable to feed these people, well, they're not going to get fed. Right? That's another tangent for another time, but yeah, it's kind of scary when you think about it. Now, here's another really good quote, and I do apologize that this is another lengthy one. I promise they're not all this long. But Marx writes about labor, quote, "First, the fact that labor is external to the worker, i.e., it does not belong to his intrinsic nature, that in his work, therefore, he does not affirm himself, but denies himself, does not feel content, but unhappy, does not develop freely his physical and mental energy, but mortifies his body and ruins his mind. The worker, therefore, only feels himself outside his work, and in his work feels outside himself. His labor is therefore not voluntary, but coerced. It is forced labor. It is therefore not the satisfaction of a need. It is merely a means to satisfy needs external to it. Its alien character emerges clearly in the fact that as soon as no physical or other compulsion exists, labor is shunned like the plague." So basically what he's saying here is that modern labor, all right, wage work, is completely external to us. If we didn't have to show up to our job, we wouldn't. Which kind of brings us to this one question. If you didn't have to go to your job tomorrow, if your survival didn't depend on it, would you? Would you still work if you won the lottery tomorrow? I'm going to bet you the odds probably not if you're like most people. So when you think about it, there's this metaphorical gun pointed at the back of your head at every second of every day. If you do not show up to your job for long enough, you're going to be dead in the streets, right? And really the Marxist point of view is that we are coerced into this miserable labor that we hate with the threat of homelessness and starvation. So if you don't work, you are going to die in the streets. And again, no one cares, right? No one will really help you. We don't have a social safety net. And this kind of brings us to this other idea that I do think is worth bringing up. That government tyranny is not the only kind of tyranny. And this is very much a thought from the far left, right? But the idea that the government is the only thing that can control your life and tell you what to do, right? Because, as Americans and Westerners generally, we see the taxes that we have to pay and all the government regulation, and we typically see the government as the only thing that can and does, control our lives, right? And the big line of thought, at least in the United States, is that if government gets too much power, especially over the free market, well, it's going to ruin everything, right? If the government gives you welfare, well, they can tell you what to do. They're going to make you dance like a monkey. Right? I've definitely heard my grandparents say things like that. And, well, that kind of ignores the reality of the situation. For a lot of people, the real tyrant in their life is not the government. It is actually the corporation or the company that they work for. In capitalism, workers have the illusion of freedom because the government does not directly enslave them, but they're still slaves. So even if it's not the government directly telling you what to do, like what happened in feudal Europe, for example, it doesn't really matter. You're still essentially a slave. Because, just because it's not the government doesn't mean it's not coercion, right? I mean, I know a lot of people that work some pretty horrible jobs. I mean, I live in a pretty poor area. And there are people that I cannot believe what their employers make them do, but they got to do it, right? Because otherwise, once again, they're going to be out on the streets, right? So that's kind of the system that we've got going on here. So this kind of brings us to another idea, and this quote is actually not part of the 5. It's actually one that kind of piggybacks off the other one, but we'll go ahead with it anyway. So Marx argued, quote, "In pre-capitalist systems, it was obvious that most people did not control their own destiny. Under feudalism, for instance, serfs had to work for their lords. Capitalism seems different because people are in theory free to work for themselves or for others as they choose. Yet, most workers have as little control over their lives as feudal serfs." So, yeah, essentially people that were tied to the land, that were not allowed to leave or do anything. You know, you might have the ability to move around. You might have the ability to find a different lord, so to speak. But you're still working for a lord, right? At the very least, that's the situation most people are in. So it kind of gets us at this other idea that you are free in theory, but not practice. So it doesn't matter, oh, you could go start your own business and become the next Jeff Bezos and become not just a millionaire, but a billionaire. You're free to do that. But, it's like, yeah, in theory, anyone can go do that. But statistically and practically, that's just not going to happen. I mean, I know some people, I live not very far from a trailer park. And I can tell you, man, the people that are children that are being raised there, they're not going to magically become venture capitalists when they grow up. I'm sorry, it's just not going to happen. In fact, if you look at the data, your zip code has a pretty strong correlation to what you're going to do with your life when you grow up. Like, it's kind of sad, really. It is very deterministic. And as much as people love to watch and think that they can become anything that they want, right? All the hustle porn, get motivated, get out there. You can do anything you set your mind to. Well, statistically, no, you cannot. Unfortunately, and that is a very sad way of seeing things, but if you want a connection with reality, I mean, that's reality there, my friend. So, basically, capitalism, according to the Marxists, is just feudalism with more steps. And that's scary because if you think back to how we think about feudalism is just slavery with more steps. So really, you can think about capitalism as just a very complicated form of slavery. So I know not everyone will probably see things that way, but it is an interesting perspective to keep in mind, right? Because there are people that believe this. Let's move on, though. So finally a short one. So this one comes from Engels, and he writes, quote, "The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie." So basically the government serves rich people. And again, I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but the bourgeoisie is a word that the Marxists used as people who own everything. So the people that own businesses, they own the land, landlords would fall under this class, the political class. These are people that don't actually do anything. They don't actually provide any value to society. The only thing that they do is they own things that create value. Right? So whether that's businesses or land or, people in some cases, right? Once upon a time, money and politics had nothing to do with each other. They didn't really interact very much. And that's because the aristocrats in medieval Europe, they thought money was dirty. If you were some kind of merchant of some kind, they just didn't really care for you, right? You had to be, down on the streets and, dealing with ordinary people and thieves and, whatnot. So it was kind of looked down upon. But if you were an elite, yet you had better things to do. You had a society to run, peasants to rule. But once we shifted over to capitalism in the late 1700s, money and politics became forever intertwined. And this is something that we have still not been able to fix, right, hundreds of years later. And that's because corporations can spend as much money as they want to influence politics, right? Much more so than you and I can, right? An individual voter, right? Even if we all came together and pooled our resources to try to fund the best candidate that we liked, we'll never really be able to outspend the corporations, right? And even if we wanted to, right, the odds of there just being some kind of failure on our part to organize, that's just inevitable. So money and politics have become forever linked, and right, even when you look at the United States today, right, or pretty much any Western liberal democracy, even supposedly left-wing politicians legislate in favor of the oligarchs. I mean, Joe Biden, right? I don't know how you feel about any of the modern issues going on, but if you look at what Joe Biden is actually doing, he's actually kind of a right-wing guy, right? He's been giving the thumbs up to drilling for more oil, which is kind of a right-wing thing to do. He promised to forgive student loan debt, which is a lefty thing to do, but he didn't do it, so that's kind of a right-wing thing to do. When politicians claim that they're going to do all these left-wing things, and then they actually get elected and don't do any of them, like that's just kind of what happens. So here's another really good one by Karl Marx, and he writes, quote, "Communism is the riddle of history solved, and it knows itself to be this solution." Now, if you're like me, your immediate reaction is, wow, this guy is full of shit. Right? This guy, I mean, he's very obviously confident in his own ideas, right? But it wasn't until I've gone down this leftist rabbit hole and really got into the meat and potatoes of what these people actually believe that I realized that he makes a very interesting case here. So if I were to kind of expand on this and how someone could write this and genuinely believe it to be true, this is how I would articulate it. So we have to bring in this idea of the Gini coefficient. If you don't know what that is, it is this index that economists use which measures wealth inequality in any given society. It's pretty standard, right? It's been around since the 1900s, so we've known about it. And basically, you get ranked on a somewhere between 0 and 1. A 0 is a society where everyone is completely equal. And 1 is a society where all the wealth belongs to a single person. Now, obviously, there is no society that is a perfect 0 and a perfect 1. We just don't have any. Pretty much everywhere is somewhere in between. Now, the closer to 1 you are, so like basically the higher your number, the more unequal things are. And generally, a higher Gini coefficient is associated with low trust in social institutions, a lack of social mobility, and an overall lower quality of life. So, if one guy, or just a few people own everything, then most people are kind of poor and miserable, right? Makes sense, right? So the way I like to think about it is this is a measure of how rigged the system is. And this is where we need to borrow an idea from the libertarian thinkers, actually, of all people. But the idea of voting with your dollars. Because when you buy something, you are proving market demand for it. If you buy food, you are proving that, oh, hey, people still want to eat food, right? But even for niche things, right? Weird things, right? I mean, let's say furry costumes, right? If you go out and buy a furry costume, you are signaling to the company that makes those things to make more. It's like, oh, hey, people will buy these furry costumes if we make them, so let's keep making them. And in that way, you, even however small an impact you have, you are proving that you are basically able to influence the world, right? However slightly. And we all do this in a very small way every time that we ever buy or sell anything, or heck, even show up to our jobs. So with that idea, you realize that if the free market is a way for you to vote with your dollars, and you don't have any money and like some other guy has like $1 billion, Well, think of how many more votes in the free market he has. He can decide that, oh, hey, I want there to be $100 million worth of sex toys laying around. Right? Like, that can totally be a thing. People, if they have enough money, they can totally be like, yeah, I want something totally stupid and horrible to be, the world we live in. And what do you know? That's a lot of the time, that's actually what they choose to happen. So, yeah, it is very interesting. So it doesn't matter if you're a good person. It doesn't matter if your ideals are good and and you show through with your actions. You're a good person. It doesn't matter. If you don't have the votes in the free market, aka the money, then the people at the top are going to be able to control everything however the hell they want, right? And if history is any indicator, it is not going to be for like a good world, right? People that are really rich and really greedy tend not to make very good decisions for the rest of humanity. But it's, again, a tangent for another time. So if you think about it, once your society reaches a certain threshold, you guarantee that there's all this wealth concentrated in just a few hands, and then you make social revolution inevitable, such as in the cases of the French and Russian revolutions. Right? One of the things that you can really note about the Russian Revolution is that the people who were rich were filthy rich. I mean, they had more money than they could ever use in 100 lifetimes. I mean, it was ungodly. Meanwhile, you had the everyday working man who literally had so little money that he couldn't keep his home warm enough in the winter that you could have bed bugs. I mean, it was literally a sign of wealth. If you had bed bugs, like that was a sign of wealth back then. Because it was so cold and so inhospitable that you couldn't have bugs. Right? The bugs died. It was so cold in your house. I mean, that is, just the most insane wealth inequality that you can imagine. So when you have conditions like that in your society, it's just a matter of time before the ordinary, everyday people say, oh, hey, we have literally nothing. Our children are dying and starving because we can't work long enough to feed them. So we're just going to kill the rich people. Right? And that's a gross oversimplification, but that is more or less how it played out. And not just in Russia, but pretty much every revolution that's ever happened in recorded history. Now, the whole idea of a Gini coefficient becomes really interesting when you think about how we evolved. Because we evolved to be part of nomadic tribes. Marx called this period in history primitive communism. Now think about it, right? The Gini coefficient was 0. Nobody really owned anything, right? Like there was no private property. You may have owned technically the clothes on your back, but all the food you got belonged not to you, but to the tribe, because everyone shared. It was inherently communal, right? So I don't think that Marx is crazy when he says that when we lived in nomadic tribes, we were experiencing primitive communism, or in a different way, a Gini coefficient of 0. Everyone was equal. Now, ever since we developed settled civilization, the Gini coefficient slowly but surely increased. This is because, well, for a lot of reasons, right? You can own land, and then that land can be passed down to your kids. You can pretty much buy up all the wealth-producing assets, right? You can buy up all the livestock. You can buy up all the businesses, right? There are a lot of things that you can do to pass down and increase your wealth. But if you don't have anything, right, you don't have anything. The only thing you have of value is your labor, which you got to pretty much give back to the tribe in order to survive. And this creates this inherent inequality. So basically, ever since we've had settled civilization, the Gini coefficient was not 0, and it slowly but surely goes up. And this is kind of why there's this perpetual revolution throughout history, right? It's a direct result of the high Gini coefficient and this wealth inequality. The fact that there are these perpetual revolutions that are going on throughout history, right? Like every few generations, there is some kind of revolution that is a result of inequality. right? Let's just call it a high Gini coefficient. This explains it all, doesn't it? I mean, during the nomadic hunter-gatherer times, there were no revolutions. I mean, there were wars with other tribes, but that was about it. It wasn't until you had settled, highly specialized civilization that all of a sudden you had inequality. And with that inequality came systems that slowly but surely kill you, right? Social death, social murder. And then there's this high Gini coefficient aspect to it, where some people have way more than they could ever need, and then everyone else has nothing. So in a way, you can think of communism as a call to return to this natural way of life, to return to a Gini coefficient of 0. Now, Marx doesn't outright say that we're going to go back to nomadic tribal times, because obviously that's not the answer, right? Even if that's what you wanted, you could not get everyone to suddenly give up settled civilization and technology and shit, right? As much as that might be a nice thought, right? Oh, just live off the land, man. No one's really gonna do that, man. I love my Doritos way too much to give this up. Right? I mean, computers. I mean, imagine going without YouTube, right? Nomadic tribes, they don't have YouTube, and I'm not sure I could function without it. But when you think about it like that, communism makes a lot more sense, doesn't it? A lot more sense. It's not the crazy demonic ideology that we've all kind of been raised to believe it is. But we'll talk more about that in another episode. So we've finally gotten to the final quote of this episode, and this is definitely the longest, the most difficult to understand, but I think it's the most interesting one in this episode. So Marx writes, quote, "In the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations which are independent of their will, namely relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness, the mode of production of material life conditions, the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. At a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with existing relations of production, or this merely expresses the same thing in legal terms, with the property relations within the framework of which they have operated hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an era of social revolution. The changes in the economic foundation lead sooner or later to the transformation of the whole immense superstructure." Hot damn, was that a mouthful. Hot damn. So if we want to break down and understand this quote, it kind of goes something like this. So basically, you're forced into a social class that determines your consciousness against your will, right? Because all of our life is determined by our relation to capital. Then we kind of got to break society down into two different things. There's the base and the superstructure. So the base is essentially the modes of production and the resulting relations, right? Typically the employer and the worker. And then we've got the superstructure. And these are the relationships and ideas not directly related to the economy, right? Things like culture, law, even politics to an extent. These are essentially controlled by our economic relations. So let's think about it like this. Changes to the economy result in changes to our very culture, our relationships with people around us, and even our consciousness, right? Because so much of your consciousness is directly related to your relationships. So when you think about it, our economy, it literally shapes the entirety of our lives. Everything. And the people that control the economy pretty much have all the control in the world. Now, don't they? So if I was to summarize the entirety of this idea, I would say that life itself is dictated by the economy and those who control the economy. Because everything comes back to these economic relations that we have between each other, right? Whether it's your employer, your customers, right? Business people, right? They influence so much of our day-to-day life. It's kind of scary, right? When you really think about it. Now, this is an idea that I probably don't have time to fully dive into because, I mean, there is so much reading and thinking you can do about just the base and the superstructure and how they, influence each other, right? How much more power the base has over the superstructure. But I'm telling you, man, going down the communism rabbit hole, it is insane. It is so insane because these guys think so much. I mean, they're just understanding, the base and the superstructure. I mean, geez Louise, it's wild. I got to give credit where credit is due. The Marxist thinkers are kind of crazy, right? These guys can really, very long-winded. Their ideas are just nuts. Absolutely nuts. I'm telling you, man. The rabbit hole of communism. But yeah, I hope you guys are as excited as I am for the rise, fall, and decay of communism. That series, man, I cannot hype you up enough for it. It's going to be crazy. We literally start going all the way back to medieval Europe, how that went to from feudalism to mercantilism, and then mercantilism to capitalism, and then all the problems with capitalism, and then why that led to communism and all these crazy Marxist thinkers. I mean, it's wild. I'm really looking forward to it. Doing the writing, reading, and research has been such a blast. So I'm going to try to make more of these notes episodes as I go along. But yeah, I hope you guys are excited for that series, and make sure to leave your comments, down below. I want to have a conversation about this stuff. I don't want to be the ivory tower intellectual. I want you guys to, push back, right? Which of these ideas did you agree with? Did you disagree with, right? I'm all for debate. I also do not delete comments. For some reason, people have accused me of deleting comments. I have never, and I never will, delete a comment on my video. You can say whatever the hell you want. I'm a free speech extremist, but be warned, if you say something stupid, I will tell you you said something stupid. So, just be warned. But yeah, thanks so much for listening all the way through. This has been History for Thinkers, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.